Let me tell you about Jake Murphy, the unluckiest guy in 17 solar systems. While other humans were out there exploring strange new worlds and boldly going where no one had gone before, Jake was stuck on Station Omega-7 with what the employment office cheerfully called a prestigious xenobiology position. Translation? He fed dragons. Giant, fire-breathing, armor-plated death machines that could reduce a grown man to his component atoms with a casual sneeze. The Vorthak dragons were the size of subway cars, had teeth like plasma cutters, and possessed what the scientists politely termed aggressive territorial instincts. What they really meant was these things would happily turn anyone within a 50-meter radius into barbecue if they felt even slightly annoyed. And Jake's job was to walk into their enclosure twice a day and serve them lunch. How did he end up with this dream career? Well, funny story. Jake used to work in military logistics until that unfortunate incident involving a supply depot, a malfunctioning gravity lift, and 3,000 tons of high-explosive mining charges. The official report called it catastrophic equipment failure. Jake called it Tuesday. His commanding officer called it grounds for immediate reassignment to the furthest possible location from anything important, hence Station Omega-7. A glorified research outpost floating in the middle of nowhere, studying creatures that most sensible beings avoided like a plague of sentient tax auditors. The station commander, a man who clearly peaked in middle school, thought having humans tend to alien apex predators was character building. Jake thought it was attempted murder with extra steps. Every morning at 0800 hours, Jake would trudge down to the dragon habitat with a hover cart full of protein cubes. Standard xenobiology fare. These things looked like gray bricks and probably tasted about as appetizing. The dragons would lumber over, chomp down their allotment with all the enthusiasm of a bureaucrat filling out forms, and then ignore Jake completely. It was mind-numbing work. The kind of job where you start questioning your life choices around hour 2 and reach existential crisis territory by lunch. Jake had perfected the art of feeding time into a precise 15-minute routine. Roll in, dump cubes, check water dispensers, roll out. No muss, no fuss, no unnecessary interaction with creatures that viewed him as a convenient appetizer. The dragons seemed equally bored with the arrangement. They'd eat their cubes with mechanical efficiency, like they were checking off items on a cosmic to-do list. Consume bland nutrition brick. Check. Contemplate the heat death of the universe. Check. Ignore the small pink creature that brings food. Double check. Jake often wondered if this was how the dragons were supposed to live. Back on their homeworld, they probably soared through alien skies, hunted exotic prey, maybe had dragon barbecues on weekends. Here, they paced around a sterile enclosure, ate processed food, and stared at the walls like inmates counting down their sentences. But hey, it paid the bills. Barely. And it kept him far away from anything he could accidentally explode. Of course, the universe had a sense of humor darker than a black hole's event horizon. Just when Jake thought his routine couldn't get any more mind-numbing, Supply Officer Betty Wrenchworth burst into his quarters at 0630 hours, with the kind of panic usually reserved for imminent reactor meltdowns. Murphy. We've got a situation. Betty was the kind of person who treated every minor inconvenience like a galactic emergency, but this time her face had that special shade of pale that meant actual trouble. Jake rolled out of his bunk, already dreading whatever bureaucratic nightmare was about to ruin his day. Let me guess. The coffee machine's broken again. Worse. The protein cube shipment's been delayed. Jake blinked. Delayed how long? 3 weeks. Minimum. 3 weeks. Jake's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. What happened to the shipment? Betty consulted her tablet with the grim expression of someone reading their own obituary. Trade dispute. The Zephyrian Collective is having a diplomatic tantrum over fishing rights in the Fluffington Nebula. They're blocking all cargo routes until someone apologizes for the Treaty of Sparkly Intentions or something equally ridiculous. Jake stared at her. The Fluffington Nebula peace accords were famous throughout the galaxy for being the most absurdly complicated diplomatic agreement ever written. It took 17 years to negotiate and covered everything from mineral rights to the proper way to address sentient gas clouds. And now it was standing between Jake and dragon food. So what you're telling me, Jake said slowly, is that intergalactic politics have conspired to leave me with nothing to feed a bunch of fire-breathing death machines. Pretty much, yeah. Within an hour, Station Commander Rex Boldridge had called an emergency meeting. Boldridge was the sort of man who wore his military uniform like armor, and spoke in the clipped tones of someone who'd watched too many war movies. He'd been assigned to Omega-7 because according to station gossip he'd once tried to court-martial a malfunctioning vending machine. Gentlemen, we have a crisis, Boldridge announced. pacing behind his desk like a caged tiger with anxiety issues. Without proper nutrition, the Vorthak specimens may become agitated. Jake raised his hand. Define agitated. They might eat the station. Ah. That kind of agitated. Betty flipped through her tablet frantically. I've been running calculations. We have emergency rations, but they're designed for human consumption. Military MREs. Freeze-dried vegetables, some canned goods. What about those protein substitutes from the medical bay? Boldridge suggested. Commander. Those are designed for beings with digestive systems roughly the size of a walnut. The dragons weigh 12 tons each. Jake watched this exchange with growing horror. These people were seriously considering feeding military rations to creatures that could melt steel with their breath. It was like trying to satisfy a grizzly bear with a handful of crackers. What about the hydroponic gardens? Betty continued. We could harvest early. You want to feed dragons lettuce. Jake couldn't keep the incredulity out of his voice. It's organic lettuce. Betty, these things have teeth that can bite through titanium. They're not going to be impressed by your commitment to sustainable agriculture. The meeting devolved into increasingly desperate suggestions. Someone proposed catching fish from the station's decorative pond. Another genius suggested grinding up furniture and adding nutritional supplements. Jake listened to this parade of terrible ideas while doing mental calculations about how quickly he could reach the escape pods. Finally, Boldridge slammed his hand on the desk. Murphy. You're our dragon expert. What do you recommend? Jake stared at him. Expert. I'm a food delivery guy with a very specialized route. I don't know what dragons like to eat. I just know they'll eat me if I don't feed them something. Well, you better figure it out. Fast. The dragons are already showing signs of increased appetite. They consumed their morning rations in half the usual time. Great. Hungry dragons. Jake's day just kept getting better. After the meeting from hell, Jake wandered the station corridors like a man facing his own execution. Which, let's be honest, he probably was. He'd seen what happened to the last guy who forgot to feed the dragons on time. They found his boots. Just his boots. Everything else had been mysteriously vaporized. That's when inspiration struck with all the subtlety of a meteorite impact. The cafeteria. The station cafeteria was overflowing with Earth comfort food, part of some misguided morale initiative from headquarters. While Jake was stuck feeding dragons flavorless protein bricks, the human crew got to enjoy pizza, hamburgers and ice cream. He found Chef Antoine Sizzleton in the kitchen, a man who took food more seriously than most people took religion. Antoine was the kind of chef who could make military rations taste like fine dining and treated every meal like a personal artistic statement. Antoine, I need your help, Jake said, bursting through the kitchen doors. The chef looked up from a tray of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, his expression suspicious. What kind of help? Because if this is about getting extra dessert rations, the answer is still no. I need to borrow some food. All of it actually. Antoine's eyebrows shot up so fast they nearly launched into orbit. All of it, Murphy? Have you finally snapped? Because I've seen the signs. The isolation, the dragon duty, the way you talk to yourself in the corridors. I don't talk to myself. You do. Last week I heard you having a full conversation with a maintenance panel about the philosophical implications of artificial gravity. Jake waved dismissively. That's not the point. The dragons are out of food, and if I don't feed them something, they're going to eat the station. Starting with me. Antoine set down his mixing spoon and stared at Jake with the expression of someone watching a friend announce their intention to juggle live grenades. You want to feed human food to alien death machines. It's better than my alternatives. Betty suggested lettuce. Mon Dieu. Antoine clutched his chest dramatically. Lettuce to dragons. This is culinary blasphemy. Within 20 minutes they'd loaded 3 hover carts with enough Earth cuisine to feed a small army. Pizza boxes stacked like a leaning tower of cheesy goodness. Hamburgers wrapped in foil like edible presents. Containers of ice cream that Antoine insisted on protecting with thermal blankets because ice cream deserves respect. Jake pushed his cart and tried not to think about how completely insane this plan was. He was about to offer pepperoni pizza to creatures that considered molten lava a refreshing beverage. The dragons would either love it or decide that Jake seasoned with oregano might make an interesting appetizer. You know, Antoine said, steering his cart with the precision of a Formula One driver, in all my years of cooking I never imagined my cuisine would be served to fire-breathing aliens. Think of it as expanding your customer base. Or getting us both eaten by creatures with very expensive tastes. They made quite a sight rolling through the station corridors. Two humans pushing carts loaded with junk food toward a habitat full of apex predators, like the galaxy's most dangerous food truck service. Other crew members stared as they passed, probably wondering if the stress of dragon duty had finally driven Jake completely over the edge. When they reached the dragon habitat, Jake stood outside the reinforced doors and experienced what philosophers might call an existential moment. On one side of those doors was his normal, boring, relatively safe routine of feeding dragons their regulation meal. On the other side was either the stupidest idea in galactic history, or the most brilliant accidental discovery since sliced bread. Second thoughts? Antoine asked, noticing Jake's hesitation. Jake looked at the carts full of food, thought about Betty's suggestion of organic lettuce, and imagined explaining to his insurance company how he'd been incinerated by hungry dragons. Nope, let's go feed some aliens pizza. The dragon habitat doors hissed open with the sound of Jake's impending doom. Or possibly his greatest triumph. At this point the universe seemed determined to keep him guessing. The three Vorthak dragons were already waiting, and they did not look happy. Normally, they'd lumber over with the enthusiasm of office workers heading to a mandatory meeting. Today they stood at attention like soldiers expecting orders, their massive heads tracking Jake's movement with laser focus. Their usual bored indifference had been replaced by something that looked distinctly like hunger-induced irritation. "Okay, big guys," Jake said, his voice only slightly higher than usual. "I know this isn't your regular Tuesday special, but we're going to try something new today." The largest dragon, which Jake had privately named Grumpy because of its perpetual scowl, tilted its head and made a sound somewhere between a growl and a question mark. It was the first time Jake had heard any of them make a noise that wasn't related to eating or breathing. Antoine wheeled his cart forward with the reverence of a priest carrying holy relics. "I suggest we start with something simple, perhaps the pizza." Jake grabbed the first box from the stack, a pepperoni pizza that smelled like heaven and looked like it belonged in a food magazine. The dragons' heads followed the box with the synchronized precision of a radar array tracking incoming missiles. "Here goes nothing," Jake muttered, opening the box and setting it on the ground about 10 feet from the nearest dragon. What happened next would be burned into Jake's memory forever. The dragon approached the pizza with the cautious curiosity of a bomb disposal expert examining suspicious wiring. It sniffed delicately, its nostrils flaring wide enough to park a small vehicle inside. Then it extended its massive tongue, roughly the size and texture of a leather sofa, and took a tentative lick. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The dragon's eyes, previously the color of molten copper, suddenly dilated to the size of dinner plates. Its head snapped back like it had been struck by lightning, and it made a sound that Jake could only describe as surprised delight mixed with existential revelation. It was the sound of a creature discovering that life had been holding out on it. Then it inhaled the entire pizza in one gulp. "Mon Dieu," Antoine whispered. "It likes it." The other two dragons were now pressing forward, their earlier lethargy replaced by something that looked suspiciously like excitement. They made soft rumbling sounds that Jake had never heard before, almost like purring but with enough bass to rattle the floor plates. Okay, Jake said, grabbing another pizza box. "There's enough for everyone. No need to start a riot." He set out two more pizzas, different varieties this time. Hawaiian for the second dragon, which Jake had dubbed Sleepy because it usually napped between meals. Supreme for the third, Grouchy, who had a habit of glaring at the walls like they owed it money. The results were even more dramatic than the first feeding. Sleepy took one bite of the Hawaiian pizza, and actually did a little happy dance, a sight that would have been adorable if it weren't being performed by a 12-ton death machine. Grouchy devoured the supreme pizza, and then looked at Jake with an expression that could only be described as grateful. "This is impossible," Antoine said, staring at the dragons with the fascination of a scientist discovering a new species. "They're showing emotional responses to food. Complex emotional responses." Jake was too busy opening hamburger containers to fully appreciate the historical significance of the moment. The dragons had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the food carts, their attention focused on him with the intensity of students watching a particularly interesting lecture. "Let's try the burgers," Jake said, unwrapping a bacon cheeseburger that looked like it had been crafted by angels. This time Grumpy stepped forward first, no longer cautious but eager. It accepted the burger with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature with claws the size of dinner knives. After the first bite, it made a sound that Jake could only interpret as pure joy. The transformation was remarkable. These weren't the same bored mechanical creatures he'd been feeding for months. Their body language had changed completely. Where they'd once stood with the posture of prisoners serving time, they now moved with the fluid grace of dancers. Their eyes, previously dull and lifeless, now sparkled with intelligence and interest. They're not just eating, Jake realized. They're tasting. Actually tasting food for the first time. Antoine nodded slowly. The protein cubes. They had no flavor, no texture, no joy. These creatures have been living on the culinary equivalent of cardboard. As if to prove his point, Sleepy approached the ice cream containers with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. Jake opened a container of chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream, and watched in amazement as the dragon sampled it with the delicacy of a wine connoisseur. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Sleepy's eyes rolled back in apparent ecstasy, and it made a sound that could only be described as a draconic sigh of contentment. Then it looked at Jake with what could only be described as adoration. I think, Jake said slowly, we might have just solved more than a feeding problem. Jake should have known that nothing good in his life could stay secret for more than 48 hours. By Thursday morning, half the station was crowded around the dragon habitat's observation windows, watching Grumpy perform what could only be described as synchronized swimming through the air in exchange for chocolate donuts. It started when Dr. Melissa Cogsworth from the xenobiology department noticed the dragon's behavioral changes during her routine observations. 1 minute she was documenting their usual listless pacing and general existential malaise, and the next she was watching Sleepy execute a perfect barrel roll to earn a slice of pepperoni pizza. Murphy, she'd said, bursting into his quarters with the wild eyes of someone who'd just discovered fire. What did you do to my dragons? Your dragons, the Vorthak specimens, are displaying unprecedented levels of cognitive engagement, physical coordination, and what appears to be happiness. They're happy, Murphy. Do you understand the scientific implications of this? Jake understood that his quiet life of boring dragon feeding had just been flushed down the cosmic toilet. Within hours, word had spread beyond the station. The first to arrive was Ambassador Glixnorp from the Rigelian Trade Federation, a being that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a tax attorney. Glixnorp had been negotiating trade agreements in the sector when news reached him that the impossible-to-domesticate Vorthak dragons were now performing aerial acrobatics for Earth snack foods. This changes everything, Glixnorp announced, his translucent head tentacles quivering with excitement. For centuries, the Vorthak have been considered too aggressive for civilization. If they can be, what is the human term, tamed through cuisine, the economic implications are staggering. Jake watched from the observation deck as Grouchy demonstrated his newfound ability to hover in place while delicately accepting a cheeseburger. The dragon had developed a preference for medium-rare beef, and would actually shake his massive head if offered anything well done. They're not tamed, Jake protested. They're just satisfied customers. But Glixnorp wasn't listening. He was already composing messages to the Galactic Council, describing what he called the Murphy method of interspecies diplomacy through comfort food. The situation escalated rapidly. By Friday, the station was hosting delegations from 12 different star systems. The Crystalline Hive Collective sent a team of insectoid observers who buzzed with excitement when Sleepy performed a loop-de-loop for vanilla ice cream. The methane breathers of Titan 7 arrived in environmental suits, fascinated by the concept of flavor-motivated behavioral modification. Commander Buldridge was in his element, strutting around the station like he'd personally orchestrated the greatest diplomatic breakthrough in galactic history. He'd ordered Jake to conduct formal feeding demonstrations 3 times a day, complete with running commentary. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted carbon-based life forms, Jake found himself announcing to an audience of alien dignitaries, witness the transformative power of properly seasoned ground beef. He felt ridiculous, but the dragons seemed to enjoy the attention. They developed distinct personalities that became more pronounced with each meal. Grumpy had revealed himself to be something of a show-off, capable of complex aerial maneuvers that defied several laws of physics. Sleepy turned out to be a gentle giant, who enjoyed having his massive head scratched while eating dessert. Grouchy, despite his name, had become the most social of the three, often approaching visitors with curious sniffs, and what could only be described as dragon smiles. The breakthrough moment came, when Representative Vashti of the warrior clans of Zerion arrived. The Zerions had been locked in a territorial dispute with the Vorthak homeworld for 3 millennia, viewing the dragons as the ultimate symbol of untamable aggression. Vashti, a 7-foot-tall warrior with more battle scars than skin, approached the habitat with the caution of someone expecting imminent combat. Jake offered him a tray of chicken wings. Want to try feeding them yourself? Vashti's honor marks flared purple with indignation. I do not feed my enemies. I defeat them in glorious battle. They're not your enemies right now, Jake said, watching Grumpy perform a graceful spiral dive to catch a falling French fry. Right now they're just big flying foodies with excellent taste in comfort food. The moment of truth came when Sleepy, drawn by the scent of barbecue sauce, approached the observation window where Vashti stood. The dragon pressed his massive snout against the reinforced glass and made the soft rumbling sound that Jake had learned meant, "Please share your delicious food." Vashti stared into the dragon's eyes, and something fundamental shifted in his worldview. Here was the legendary terror of his people, the unstoppable force that had haunted Xerion nightmares for generations, asking politely for a chicken wing. "This is impossible," Vashti whispered. "The Vorthak know only rage and destruction. Turns out they also know the difference between original recipe and extra crispy," Jake replied, offering the warrior a barbecue wing. "Want to make history?" The image of a scarred Xerion warrior hand-feeding chicken wings to a contented Vorthak dragon through the habitat's feeding slot became the most widely distributed photograph in galactic media. Within days, it was being called the wing that changed the universe. Peace negotiations that had stalled for centuries suddenly resumed with unprecedented enthusiasm. The Vorthak homeworld, previously off-limits to all visitors, extended formal invitations to culinary delegations from across the galaxy. Trade routes that had been closed for millennia reopened as species that had been mortal enemies discovered a shared appreciation for Earth comfort food. Jake found himself appointed as the station's chief interspecies culinary liaison, a title that came with a significant pay raise and absolutely no idea what his actual job description entailed. He suspected it involved a lot more diplomatic dinners and a lot less hiding from dragons. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Dr. Cogsworth asked him during one of his new consultation sessions with visiting xenobiologists. Jake watched Grouchy teaching a group of young Andromedian scholars how to properly appreciate the subtle flavor differences between various pizza toppings. "I fed some dragons junk food. You've revolutionized interspecies relations through the universal language of good eating. You've proven that aggression and hostility often stem from unmet basic needs. You've shown that even the most fearsome creatures can be transformed by simple acts of caring and attention to their well-being." Jake considered this while Sleepy demonstrated his ability to catch donuts mid-flight for a delighted audience of gaseous beings from the Whirlpool Galaxy. "So what you're saying is, I accidentally became a diplomat by figuring out that everyone's nicer when they're well-fed." "Precisely. Huh. And here I thought I was just trying not to get eaten." 6 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of what was now officially called the Intergalactic Culinary Diplomacy Center, formerly known as that boring research station in the middle of nowhere. The view had changed considerably. Where once there had been empty space and the occasional supply ship, now there was a constant stream of vessels from every corner of the galaxy, all coming to witness what the media had dubbed the Murphy Miracle. The dragons had become celebrities. Grumpy had his own social media following across 17 different galactic networks, with millions of beings tuning in daily to watch him perform aerial stunts for increasingly elaborate Earth desserts. Sleepy had been featured on the cover of Interstellar Living magazine, photographed while gracefully accepting a 7-layer cake from a delegation of sentient crystals. Grouchy had become the unofficial mascot of the newly formed Galactic Culinary Peace Initiative, his image appearing on everything from diplomatic treaties to lunchboxes sold in gift shops across the Andromeda Galaxy. Jake's own transformation had been equally dramatic, though considerably more bewildering. His official title was now Chief Interspecies Culinary Diplomat and Ambassador of Nutritional Understanding, which came with a uniform that had more medals than he knew what to do with, and a salary that made his old logistics job look like pocket change. He'd gone from being the guy who accidentally blew up supply depots to being the guy who accidentally solved intergalactic warfare through the strategic application of comfort food. "The irony is not lost on me," Jake said to his reflection in the observation window, adjusting yet another commendation ribbon that had been pinned to his chest that morning by the Galactic Council's Secretary of Peaceful Coexistence. Behind him, the latest group of diplomatic trainees was taking notes as Antoine, now bearing the title Master Chef of Interspecies Harmony, demonstrated the proper technique for preparing what had become known as reconciliation burgers for a mixed group of former enemies. The plasma entities of Rigel Beta were sharing onion rings with the silicon-based collective of Tau Ceti species that had been shooting at each other just last month. The transformation hadn't been limited to the station. Reports flooded in daily from across the galaxy of successful Murphy method implementations. The centuries-long war between the hive minds of Epsilon Eridani had ended when someone introduced them to pizza delivery. The territorial disputes in the Horsehead Nebula were resolved through a series of potluck dinners. The notorious space pirate Brotherhood of Cygnus had reformed themselves into a traveling food truck operation, spreading Earth cuisine and goodwill throughout the Outer Rim territories. Jake's personal favorite success story involved the mechanical collective of Binary System 7, artificial intelligences, who had declared war on all organic life forms until they discovered the concept of flavor through advanced chemical analysis of chocolate chip cookies. They now spent their time creating increasingly sophisticated recipes and had opened the galaxy's first robot-run bakery. Ambassador Murphy, came a voice behind him. Jake turned to see Commander Buldridge approaching with his usual military bearing, though these days he looked considerably more relaxed. The man who had once panicked about hungry dragons now oversaw the most successful diplomatic initiative in galactic history, a fact that had earned him a promotion to Admiral and a permanent assignment to oversee what everyone was calling the Murphy Doctrine. Admiral, Jake acknowledged, still getting used to the rapid promotions that had swept through the station's command structure. How did the morning session go? Remarkably well. The tentacled overlords of Betelgeuse have agreed to a non-aggression pact with the crystalline matriarchy, in exchange for the recipe for chocolate soufflé. We're looking at the longest period of galactic peace in recorded history, Murphy. All because you fed some dragons pizza. Jake looked out at the bustling traffic of diplomatic vessels, each one carrying representatives who had come to learn the principles of what scholars were already calling nutritional diplomacy. The absurdity of it all still struck him daily. He'd gone from being the galaxy's most incompetent logistics officer to its most successful accidental diplomat, and all because he'd refused to feed lettuce to fire-breathing aliens. You know what the strangest part is? Jake said, watching as Grumpy executed a perfect triple axel through a ring of holographic fire, while a crowd of Andromedian dignitaries applauded enthusiastically. I actually think I understand what happened now. Oh, everyone was so focused on the dragons being these terrifying, untamable death machines that nobody bothered to consider they might just be lonely, bored, stuck in a routine that had no joy, no variety, no connection to anything meaningful. Jake paused, struck by his own words. Kind of like I was actually. The truth was, the dragons hadn't been the only ones transformed by that first desperate experiment with Earth comfort food. Jake had discovered something he'd never expected to find in his dead-end job: purpose. Not the manufactured purpose that came with fancy titles and diplomatic ceremonies, but the simple satisfaction of seeing beings light up with genuine happiness over something as basic as a well-prepared meal. The universe has a sense of humor, Jake continued, watching Sleepy demonstrate his signature move of catching falling donuts with balletic grace to a group of gaseous beings who communicated entirely through changes in luminosity. I spent my whole life accidentally breaking things, and it turns out the one thing I accidentally fixed was everything. Admiral Buldridge nodded thoughtfully. The Galactic Council is already implementing Murphy method protocols throughout all contested territories. There's talk of establishing a permanent department of culinary diplomacy, with you as the Secretary General. Jake considered this. Secretary General of Culinary Diplomacy. It had a nice ring to it, even if he still had no idea what that would actually involve on a day-to-day basis. Probably a lot more fancy dinners and a lot fewer opportunities to hide in supply closets when things went wrong. Think about it, Buldridge continued. You could retire tomorrow as the man who accidentally achieved what centuries of traditional diplomacy couldn't accomplish. Peace through properly seasoned ground beef. But as Jake watched the three dragons interact with their daily parade of visitors, he realized he didn't want to retire. For the first time in his life, he had a job that actually mattered, even if he'd stumbled into it through a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and cosmic irony. Admiral, Jake said finally, I think I'll stick around. Someone needs to make sure the dragons get their afternoon snacks, and I've gotten pretty good at not being eaten by grateful aliens. Fair enough, Murphy. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Try not to accidentally revolutionize anything else this week. The paperwork from the last revolution is still being processed. Jake grinned, watching as Grouchy performed an impromptu dance routine for a delegation of sentient mathematical equations, who expressed their approval through complex algebraic applause. No promises, Admiral. But I'll try to keep any future accidents to a minimum. As the twin suns of the system set behind the diplomatic fleet, casting the observation deck in warm golden light, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd gone from supply depot destroyer to dragon feeder to galactic peacemaker, all because he'd refused to accept that good enough was actually good enough. Sometimes the universe's biggest problems had the simplest solutions. Sometimes the most important discoveries came from the most mundane accidents. And sometimes, all it took to change everything was one person willing to serve pizza to fire-breathing aliens and see what happened next. Not bad for a guy who'd only had one job to do.